Hello there, and welcome to Simply About Earth, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to discovery. Tonight's quiet journey drifts over a sea of golden dunes across horizons that ripple like waves frozen in time. We're going to a place that many imagine as lifeless, endless, empty. But beneath its silence may lie the oldest whispers of civilization itself, the Sahara Desert. A landscape that seems timeless but might be keeping time's earliest secrets. Before we wander too far into the sand, tell me something. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop a comment below. I'd love to know if you're somewhere cold where the air carries the hum of late traffic, or maybe you're in a place where the night is quiet and the stars feel close. Wherever you are, I'd like you to imagine the desert for a moment, not as a harsh place, but as one vast sleeping body, breathing slowly under the stars. The Sahara today stretches over 9 million square kilometers, covering nearly all of North Africa, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. It's the largest hot desert on Earth, a continent within a continent. Seen from above, it looks almost alien. Mountain ranges drowned in dunes, dry riverbeds twisting like veins across a body that once pulsed with water. But here's the strange thing. For most of human history, it wasn't like this. The Sahara we know, the endless sun-baked expanse, might just be a passing phase, a brief dry chapter in a much longer, wetter story. If we could roll back time, not just centuries, but tens of thousands of years, we'd find that much of what's now sand was once savanna, green plains dotted with lakes and rivers, home to giraffes, hippos, elephants, and early humans. The air would hum with insects, the soil soft beneath bare feet. It was alive, fertile, and thriving. Scientists call these intervals the African humid periods, times when the region's climate shifted dramatically, turning desert to grassland. The most recent one ended about 5,000 years ago, right around when ancient Egypt began to rise. Coincidence, perhaps, or maybe not. The rhythm of the Sahara's transformations follows a cosmic pattern. Every 20,000 years or so, Earth's tilt and orbit change slightly, altering how sunlight warms the continents. When the northern hemisphere gets a bit more summer heat, the monsoon rains move northward, the Sahara blooms. When the cycle swings back, the rains retreat and the green gives way to gold again. This breath of the planet has been repeating for millions of years. Lush, dry, painting and erasing civilizations that might never have made it into recorded history. For archaeologists, that cycle is both a gift and a curse. The sands preserve things beautifully, but they also hide them deeply. Satellites have detected ancient river systems buried beneath the dunes, their courses still visible from space. There are traces of lake beds so vast they could have rivaled modern seas. Some researchers believe that within those lost basins, entire networks of human settlements might be entombed, waiting for rediscovery. It's as if the desert is holding its breath, keeping secrets until the right moment. For centuries, travelers and scientists alike have speculated that before Egypt, before Mesopotamia, maybe even before the Indus Valley, there existed a civilization here that was washed away, not by water but by the absence of it. They point to ancient rock art, stone circles, and forgotten tools scattered across regions that now seem utterly uninhabitable. Each one suggests that people not only lived here, they thrived. Imagine standing in what's now the Central Sahara near the Tassili Niger Plateau in southeastern Algeria. The land looks barren, all ochre rock and wind. But then you step into a sheltered canyon, and on the walls around you are paintings, thousands of them. Herds of cattle, people dancing, swimming, hunting with bows and spears. The scenes are vivid, joyful, and utterly out of place in a desert that hasn't seen rain in millennia. They speak of rivers, of grasslands, of communities that once organized their days around water and migration. It's hard not to wonder who they were. Were they nomads who simply followed the green as the rain shifted, or something more permanent, a settled people who built, traded, and shaped a culture that left faint traces for the wind to bury. Some evidence points toward the latter. Across Niger, Chad, Libya, and Egypt, archaeologists have uncovered pottery shards, stone tools, even remnants of dwellings. Not primitive campsites, but signs of coordinated living, storage pits, hearths, and organized layouts that suggest planning. In the far southwest of Egypt lies Nabta Playa, one of the most intriguing places in the Sahara. To the untrained eye, it's just a dry lake bed scattered with stones. But in the late 20th century, archaeologists found that those stones weren't random. They'd been arranged, some in alignments that match the solstices, others forming circles that might predate Stonehenge by 1,000 years. The site was active around 7,000 years ago during a time when the Sahara was still green. People gathered there seasonally, probably to celebrate the rains and the cycles of the stars. It's here that the story of the Sahara begins to sound less like prehistory and more like a forgotten prologue to civilization itself. These weren't isolated foragers, they were astronomers, herders, engineers of ritual and memory. When the desert began to dry again, they may have moved east, following the Nile, bringing their knowledge of water, crops, and celestial timing with them. Some researchers even speculate that the rise of Egyptian civilization was seeded by migrations out of the Sahara as it turned arid. The idea isn't proven, but it's compelling that the Sahara, far from being the cradle of emptiness, might have been the cradle before the cradle. Satellite imagery continues to add pieces to this puzzle. High-resolution scans reveal patterns under the sand that resemble river deltas and floodplains. Some show concentric shapes that could be geological or perhaps the remains of ancient settlements. One region in Mauritania, the Richat structure, often called the Eye of the Sahara, has inspired endless debate. It's a massive circular formation visible from space, made of concentric rings of rock. Geologists say it's a natural dome eroded over time, but its symmetry, size, and the presence of ancient artifacts in nearby areas have sparked speculation that it might have once been a hub of early human activity. The science doesn't support that link, but the fascination tells us something. The desert invites wonder, partly because it hides more than it reveals. For scientists working in the Sahara, even reaching these sites can be a challenge. The terrain shifts constantly, dunes move like tides, and temperatures swing between extremes. But with ground-penetrating radar, remote sensing, and isotope analysis, we're starting to piece together what the landscape once looked like. Layers of fossilized pollen and sediment cores from ancient lakes show unmistakable evidence of grasses, trees, and water-loving species. It wasn't just habitable, it was abundant. That abundance changed the course of human evolution. Early Homo sapiens, and even older hominins before them, used these green corridors as migration routes. The Sahara wasn't always a barrier between North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. It was a bridge. Genetic studies suggest that during the wet periods, populations mixed across vast distances, spreading technologies, languages, and ideas. When the desert returned, those groups became isolated again, preserving fragments of their once shared cultures. It's like a heartbeat in slow motion. Connection, separation, connection, separation, over tens of thousands of years. If you look at the Sahara today, it can feel impossible to imagine life thriving there. Yet every grain of sand is part of that memory. The wind still uncovers fossilized fish, petrified wood, and even the footprints of ancient animals that once crossed muddy plains. It's as if the desert occasionally exhales, revealing what it's been holding on to. And perhaps the most haunting part of all is this: the Sahara might not always stay dry. The same orbital cycles that turned it green before will one day do so again. It may take thousands of years, but eventually rains will return. Rivers will carve through dunes once more. Lakes will reappear, and life will follow. If humanity is still around, we may witness the desert's rebirth, a second chance for a landscape that has seen civilizations come and go like waves against its timeless shore. Until then, It keeps its secrets. The lost rivers still trace their paths under the sand. The rock paintings still wait in the shade of forgotten cliffs. The stories of people who lived and dreamed there remain half buried, half whispered by the wind. When we imagine the Sahara, we often see heat rising from the sand in shimmering waves, an endless stretch of dunes under a sky so bright it feels almost metallic. But long before it was a desert, before the sun baked its surface into silence, the Sahara was green, not just a patch or two of grass near an oasis, but an enormous thriving ecosystem stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Red Sea. To picture it properly, you have to unlearn the desert a little. Forget the dryness, the glare, the mirage. Instead, think of wide plains covered in tall grasses and scattered acacia trees, herds of antelope grazing in the shade, elephants lumbering through shallow pools, crocodiles slipping into water thick with reeds. There were thunderstorms in the afternoons, monsoon rains that turned the ground dark and fragrant. The air would have been heavy with the smell of damp earth, and above it all, the same constellations we see now, mirrored in the reflections of lakes that have since disappeared into dust. This world, lush and restless, came and went many times. The Sahara's greening wasn't a one-time event. It followed the slow rhythm of Earth's orbit, a cosmic metronome keeping time with the tilt of the planet. About every 20,000 years, that tilt shifts just enough to change where the rains fall. During those intervals, the monsoon winds push farther north, carrying moisture deep into what's now desert. Grasslands spread, rivers reawaken. The Sahara breathes in. Then, as the tilt swings back, the monsoons retreat, the rains fade, and the Sahara exhales. The grass dies, the lakes dry up, and dunes crawl back over the bones of rivers. This cycle has played out over and over for millions of years. During the last Green Age, roughly between 14,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was at its most hospitable. Fossil evidence tells the story. Beneath the sand, researchers have found the remains of fish, hippos, and crocodiles, animals that couldn't survive in a desert. Fossilized pollen trapped in ancient sediments tells us what grew there: grasses, shrubs, and even trees that still thrive farther south today. It wasn't just a few patches of greenery. It was an entire landscape transformed. If you could stand there then, maybe near what's now the heart of Libya or Chad, you'd see lakes spreading out to the horizon. Some, like the ancient Mega-Chad, were enormous, larger than the Caspian Sea. It's hard to imagine such scale in a place now so dry, but the evidence is clear. The outlines of those vanished lakes are still visible from satellites, faint scars of shorelines that loop across the desert like ghost coastlines. In their basins, you can still find shells of freshwater snails, the remains of fish bones, and even footprints fossilized in once wet mud. The animals that lived there tell their own story. Fossil records and ancient rock carvings show elephants, giraffes, buffalo, and even lions. There were turtles, crocodiles, and herds of cattle. These creatures weren't visitors. They belonged there. They grazed, hunted, and nested in the Sahara's rivers and grasslands, part of an ecosystem that had found balance in what we now call an extreme environment. And where there were animals, there were people. Archaeologists have uncovered tools and artifacts scattered across the region, some tens of thousands of years old. Stone blades, scrapers, and pottery fragments speak of humans who hunted, fished, and gathered here long before the sands arrived. They lived along the shores of those vanished lakes, moving with the seasons, building temporary camps that may have lasted generations. Their world was full of color: green plains, dark waters, gray storms, red sunsets. They painted it on rock walls and carved it into memory. In Algeria's Tassili N'Ajjer Mountains, the rock art is so abundant it's almost overwhelming. There are scenes of swimming figures, people with bows and arrows, women carrying pots, and animals that couldn't survive a single day in the Sahara now. The pigments have faded, but the meaning remains. These people weren't just surviving, they were thriving. They had time for art, for ceremony, and for memory. Some of those images show cattle herding, A detail that's more profound than it might seem. Domestic cattle imply a structured way of life. Herding requires planning, knowing where water will be, when the grass will grow, and how to move with the seasons. It means cooperation and shared knowledge, the kind that forms the backbone of community. This wasn't just a scattering of hunters, it was an organized society shaped by the land and its rhythms. When scientists began dating the artifacts from these green Sahara periods, they noticed something remarkable. The timing of its drying coincides closely with the rise of complex societies along the Nile. As the desert began to lose its water, the people who once lived among its lakes and plains may have migrated toward the river that never stopped flowing. The Nile became a refuge, and perhaps also a new beginning. Those who had learned to track the rains and manage herds brought their skills with them, laying the foundations for agriculture, settlement, and eventually civilization. That connection between climate change and human development is one of the Sahara's great lessons. When the environment shifted, people adapted, not by giving up, but by moving, learning, and transforming their way of life. The drying of the Sahara wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a catalyst, one that might have shaped the course of history. Without it, Egypt as we know it might never have emerged. The lakes themselves were worlds within worlds. Some were shallow and temporary, forming only during the wettest years. Others lasted millennia. Sediment cores from these basins show layers of clay, silt, and organic matter built up over thousands of years. Each layer is a page in the Sahara's diary, a record of when the rains came, what plants grew, and how life pulsed through the region. Scientists can even trace tiny particles of pollen carried by the wind from distant forests, revealing how far the green reached during the wettest periods. One of the most striking findings from these cores is the presence of algae and diatoms, microscopic organisms that only live in fresh water. Their remains are like timestamps, confirming that lakes once covered vast stretches of what is now sand. Some of those lakes lasted so long that they developed their own ecosystems, complete with species that existed nowhere else on Earth. When the water finally vanished, so did they. The desert, in a way, is built upon their fossils. To stand in those dry basins today is to feel the weight of transformation. The surface is cracked and pale, the horizon blurred by heat. Yet just a few meters below, the soil still contains traces of moisture. In some areas, the groundwater that once fed those ancient lakes remains trapped in aquifers. This is what modern oases depend on, a buried inheritance from the green Sahara. Every palm grove that rises from the desert today is a faint echo of that lush past. The story of the Sahara's greening also stretches beyond Africa. Similar cycles occurred in Arabia, in the Thar Desert of India, even in parts of Australia. These global patterns remind us that Earth's climate is interconnected, shaped by orbital wobbles and solar rhythms far beyond our control. Understanding these shifts helps scientists predict what might come next. If the Sahara has turned green before, could it do so again? The answer is yes, at least in theory. The same orbital cycles that last humid period will eventually return over the next 10,000 years. As Earth's tilt and orbit continue to shift, the Sahara could once again transform into grassland. In fact, early signs of this change can already be observed in small ways. Some models suggest that with enough rainfall and vegetation, the desert could flip rapidly into a wetter state. But the human factor complicates that natural rhythm. Greenhouse gas emissions and global warming may alter the cycles or override them entirely. If rainfall patterns shift differently because of human influence, the Sahara's future could diverge from its past. It's a sobering thought that a pattern written in the sky for millions of years could be disrupted by what happens here on the ground. Still, the idea of a green Sahara remains captivating. It challenges the way we think about deserts, not as dead zones but as places of transformation. The sand hides not only fossils and artifacts, but memory. For ancient humans, the greening of the Sahara must have felt like a miracle. Imagine being part of a lineage that had known only arid landscapes. suddenly finding rivers that flowed year after year, herds of animals to hunt, and soil that could grow plants. It would have seemed like the world itself had turned generous. They built their lives around that generosity, trusting it would last. When it began to fade, they must have watched with confusion as the lakes shrank and the rains grew fickle. Slowly their home turned back into sand. Yet even in its drying, the Sahara offered lessons. Those who lived through the change carried their stories with them. They painted their memories on stone, left tools behind in the layers of silt, and passed down oral traditions that spoke of times when the desert was green. Some of those myths survive thousands of years later. In cultures far from the Sahara, tales of lost paradises and vanished rivers. The desert remembers because people made it remember. If you're enjoying this journey so far, and finding these hidden stories as fascinating as I do, a like would really help this video reach others who might love discovering the secrets our planet keeps. Your support means the world to me. Beneath the dunes of the Sahara, hidden under kilometers of sand, lie the ghost paths of rivers that once crossed an entirely different world. They are not visible to the eye now, but from space, the traces remain like faint scars across a sleeping face. Ancient riverbeds, long dry, meander through the subsurface layers of the desert, some stretching for hundreds, even thousands of kilometers. Their shapes are unmistakable. The branching deltas, the sinuous bends, the wide floodplains that once carried water and life. If we could peel back the sand like a thin veil, we would find the arteries of a land that once pulsed with movement, connecting lakes, forests, and people. The story of these rivers began long before recorded time, in an era when climate and geography were partners in creating vast networks of flowing water. Geologists studying the Sahara's subsurface through radar imaging, satellite observation, and sediment analysis have discovered at least half a dozen major river systems buried beneath the sand. Among them are the Tamanrasset River, the Kufra River, the Irha, and others whose courses once cut from deep inland Africa all the way to the Atlantic or the Mediterranean. They are not myths, not guesses, but real channels preserved like fossils in stone and dust. The Tamanrasset River is perhaps the most astonishing of them all. Its traces were first detected through radar data collected by satellites in the early 2000s. When scientists processed the images, what appeared were the unmistakable outlines of a colossal river valley, a channel stretching from the Hogga Mountains in southern Algeria, across the heart of the Sahara, and down to the coast of Mauritania, where it emptied into what is now the Atlantic Ocean. If it flowed today, it would rival the Niger or even the Nile. Its basin covered over 1 million square kilometers, and during wet periods it might have carried as much water as the Mississippi. The river's discovery changed how scientists viewed the Sahara. It meant that not only was the desert once green, but it also had a vast and intricate hydrological network. This wasn't a patchwork of isolated lakes, but a connected system of life where fish, crocodiles, and early humans could have traveled for hundreds of kilometers along water routes. It stitched the landscape together, making migration, trade, and communication possible, long before cities or written records. Imagining those rivers flowing again is like seeing an alternate version of Earth, one that existed in the same space as ours, but in another time. The banks of the Tamanrasset would have been lush with vegetation, home to reeds and papyrus, fig trees and willows. Herds of gazelle and antelope would have come to drink in the evenings, their hooves pressing into the soft mud, and where animals gathered, people followed. Archaeological sites near the Tamanrasset's ancient basin contain stone tools and artifacts dated to around 10,000 years ago. They belong to cultures that flourished during the last African humid period, when the Sahara's rains returned after the last ice age. These tools are not primitive leftovers. They're carefully crafted points, scrapers, and blades that reveal intelligence and precision. Whoever made them was skilled not just at surviving, but at thriving in a landscape that provided everything they needed. Further east, beneath the sands of Libya and Egypt, lies the trace of another forgotten river system known as the Kufra River. Satellite radar mapping has revealed channels and deltas buried beneath the dunes of the eastern Sahara, showing that this river once flowed north toward the Mediterranean. It connected a series of ancient basins that now form the Kufra and Tibesti regions. In its time, it would have been a highway of fertility, feeding large wetlands where animals grazed and humans settled seasonally. The remains of fossilized riverbanks still contain deposits of clays and silts, unmistakable signs of long-standing water. Some of these buried channels have even been linked to underground aquifers that still store water from those ancient rivers. The Nubian sandstone aquifer system, for example, which stretches beneath Egypt, Libya, Chad and Sudan, is one of the largest reserves of fossil water in the world. It's the trapped memory of those vanished rivers, a hidden sea locked beneath the desert floor. Wells drilled into it bring up water that fell as rain thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years ago. Every drop that surfaces is, in a sense, a message from a greener earth. This buried network tells us that the Sahara wasn't an isolated desert, but once part of a vast connected world. Rivers linked the interior of Africa to the coasts, creating corridors of life that may have guided early human migration. When Homo sapiens began spreading out of Africa roughly 100,000 years ago, these rivers might have served as routes northward, rather than crossing endless dunes. Our ancestors may have walked along flowing water, resting in the shade, following the sound of birds and frogs, the sounds of home. One of the most revealing pieces of evidence for these ancient waterways comes not from the surface but from space. Using satellite radar systems like NASA's Shuttle Radar Topography mission, scientists have been able to see through the thin upper layer of sand to detect buried geological structures. The radar waves bounce differently off compact rock, moist sediment or dry dunes, revealing ghostly outlines that can't be seen by the naked eye. It's like holding up an X-ray to the planet and watching its bones appear. These images have exposed vast branching networks, old river deltas, braided channels and floodplains long gone from the surface. Among them are the unmistakable traces of lakes once fed by these rivers. The most famous of these ancient bodies of water is Lake Mega Chad, which once occupied much of what is now Chad, Niger, and Nigeria. At its greatest extent, it covered nearly 400,000 square kilometers, an inland sea larger than all the Great Lakes of North America combined. Its shores would have been lined with fishers and herders, its waters filled with hippos and crocodiles. When it eventually dried up, it left behind the much smaller Lake Chad we know today, a fraction of its former self. But its sediments still contain evidence of the creatures that once lived there, as well as traces of human occupation, hearths, pottery, and tools buried in layers of silt. The existence of such lakes and rivers doesn't just tell us about the Sahara's past, it also provides clues about its role in human history. For decades, archaeologists assumed that the earliest centers of civilization developed independently along great rivers, the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus. But the buried rivers of the Sahara challenge that assumption. If there were once extensive river systems running through North Africa, then it's possible that human communities in these regions developed complex cultures earlier than we've recognized. The evidence of structured settlements, astronomical knowledge, and animal domestication at places like Nabda Playa supports that idea. Civilization might not have sprung fully formed from the Nile Valley. It may have drifted there on the last tides of the Sahara's rivers. And yet, the sands remain mostly unexplored. Political instability, extreme conditions, and the sheer vastness of the region make archaeological work difficult. Much of what we know comes from remote sensing rather than excavation. Scientists can map the outlines of these buried systems, but actually reaching them, uncovering their artifacts, their fossils, their remnants of habitation, is still rare. Every expedition risks being swallowed by the desert's heat or buried by shifting dunes before the day's end. Despite that, the search continues. Teams equipped with ground-penetrating radar and drones are mapping new sections of these hidden rivers each year. They've found that even in areas once considered lifeless, traces of ancient habitation persist: hearths, grinding stones, fragments of pottery embedded in dry riverbeds. These are the fingerprints of a people who lived by the water's edge long after it began to fade. What's striking is how recently some of these rivers might have flowed. Sediment analysis suggests that water was present in parts of the central Sahara as recently as 5,000 years ago, a blink of an eye in geological terms. Some valleys still channel seasonal runoff during rare rainstorms, their dry beds briefly transformed into torrents before evaporating again. To stand in one of these wadis during a sudden rain is to glimpse for a moment the ancient Sahara reawakening. There's something almost paradoxical about it. The idea that beneath one of the driest places on Earth lies evidence of water everywhere. The Sahara, for all its silence, is not dead. It's sleeping, layered with memory. Its sands are like pages of a book written over and over by climate, by wind, by time. Each dune might have been a riverbank once. Each grain of sand, a fragment of stone washed smooth by water that hasn't flowed for 10,000 years. When the winds die down across the Sahara, sometimes the sand gives up a secret. Not all at once, not loudly, but slowly, as if the desert itself exhales. What emerges might be a shard of pottery, a fragment of bone, or a series of indentations shaped like footprints pressed into hardened mud thousands of years ago. They don't look like much at first, a few depressions in the dust scattered across a barren landscape. But to archaeologists, these small marks are more than curiosities. They are proof of presence, the traces of lives once lived along the forgotten shores of the Sahara's vanished lakes. Footprints are fragile things. They only survive when the conditions are perfect, when wet ground dries quickly, when wind covers them with fine dust before erosion wipes them away. In most places they disappear within days. But in the Sahara, time behaves differently. The same dryness that makes the desert harsh also makes it protective. Without water to wash them away, ancient imprints can endure suspended between erosion and preservation. In recent decades, scientists have found footprints scattered across what used to be riverbanks and lake beds, silent evidence that people once walked there when the Sahara was not sand but soil. One of the most remarkable discoveries came in what's now northern Niger, near the site of Goburo. To the untrained eye, Goburo is just another patch of desolation, flat, wind-blown, utterly lifeless. But beneath the surface, it hides an ancient lake shore that was once alive with human activity. Around 10,000 years ago, the region held a freshwater lake surrounded by grasslands and trees. People camped along its edges, hunted nearby, and buried their dead in shallow graves overlooking the water. When the lake finally dried up, it sealed their world beneath layers of sand, preserving it with almost impossible tenderness. Archaeologists uncovered dozens of burials there, along with pottery, stone tools, and the fossilized remains of fish and crocodiles. The skeletons told a story not of hardship, but of community. Some were found in groups, carefully arranged as if placed with intention. One of the most famous burials is that of a woman and two children, their bodies positioned together, their hands almost touching. Pollen grains found in the sediment suggested that flowers had been laid with them. Even after 10,000 years, the gesture feels human in the most familiar sense, love expressed in the face of loss. The people of Gobro belong to two distinct cultures separated by centuries. The first, known as the Kiffian, lived there when the Sahara was lush and the lake full. They were tall, strong hunter-fishers who relied on the rich waters around them. When the climate dried for a few thousand years, the lake disappeared, and so did the Kiffian. Later, when rains returned, a second group arrived, the Tenerians. They were smaller, more delicate, perhaps pastoralists who herded cattle and goats. Their presence shows how the Sahara's rhythm shaped not just the landscape, but entire societies. The same spot could host life, lose it, and then host it again, like a door opening and closing with each changing climate. Gobero isn't the only place where ancient footprints and shorelines have resurfaced. Across the desert, from Mauritania to Sudan, faint traces of human movement emerge from time to time. Stone circles marking campsites, hearths still blackened with charcoal, fishing tools lying where they were dropped. In southern Libya near the Tadrak Mountains, archaeologists have found similar remains, pottery, animal bones, and carvings that suggest a complex relationship with the environment. People didn't just pass through, they lived here, adapted, and flourished. Each discovery challenges the stereotype of the Sahara as a place of emptiness. The truth is that it has been a crossroads for as long as there have been humans to cross it. The ancient lakes that once dotted its surface served as magnets for life, drawing in animals and people from across the continent. Shorelines, after all, are where stories converge. They're places of arrival and departure, of sustenance and exchange. Along the edges of those vanished waters, people hunted, fished, traded, and told stories about the rains that came and went. One of the key ways scientists trace those ancient shorelines is through satellite imagery. From space, the Sahara's surface holds subtle clues invisible from the ground. Long, curving ridges of sediment mark where waves once lapped. The patterns of salt flats or sebkhas trace the outlines of evaporated lakes. In the eastern Sahara, near the border of Chad and Sudan, the Wadi Hawa stands out as a great dry river valley that once connected the central Sahara to the Nile. It's thought to have been a corridor of life linking ecosystems and human populations for thousands of years. Archaeological surveys along the Wadi have found stone tools, animal bones, and hearths dating back to the last humid period. When the river finally dried up, it cut off the Sahara from the Nile, isolating communities and changing the course of human movement across Africa. That isolation may explain one of the most intriguing puzzles in prehistory: why civilizations seem to arise independently in different parts of the world around the same time. If the Sahara once supported early cultures that were later scattered by drought, those people might have carried fragments of their knowledge outward to the Nile, to the Sahel, to the Mediterranean. In that sense, the Sahara's drying didn't erase history. It redistributed it. Its people became the seeds of new beginnings elsewhere. But before they left behind traces of a rich existence. The archaeological record is full of small personal artifacts that speak volumes. Beads made from shells carried hundreds of kilometers from the sea, suggesting trade or long-distance travel. Grinding stones used to prepare grains and roots. These objects aren't just functional, they show creativity and communication, hints of ritual and identity. Some of the pottery found along ancient Saharan lake shores is decorated with wavy lines, possibly imitations of water. Even in art, they were remembering the thing that sustained them. Sometimes their legacy is preserved not in artifacts, but in the land itself. The shapes of dunes and dry valleys follow the contours of the lakes that came before. In the low light of sunrise or sunset, you can still see the outlines of ancient shorelines stretching for miles. They are subtle, like memories half faded, but they're there, and in those shapes you can read the story of a world that once thrived. Scientists studying isotopes in fossilized shells and bones can even reconstruct the chemistry of the water that filled those lakes. The ratios of oxygen isotopes reveal changes in temperature and rainfall, helping to map the Sahara's climatic history in remarkable detail. It's like decoding a diary written by minerals instead of ink. The results show fluctuations in water levels that correspond closely to known periods of global climate change. When glaciers advanced in the north, the Sahara dried. When they retreated, it bloomed. The fates of ice and sand were linked across continents. There's also evidence that the people who lived along these ancient lakes weren't isolated tribes, but part of a broad network. Similar tools, pottery styles, and burial practices appear across regions separated by hundreds of kilometers. This suggests that even without cities or writing, communication and exchange flourished. The Sahara's rivers and lakes acted as natural highways, bringing people together across vast distances. In that sense, the Sahara wasn't just a place of early habitation, it was an early stage for human connection. Every discovery reinforces the same quiet truth. The desert we see today is only one moment in a much longer story. Beneath its dunes lies layer upon layer of human experience, each one covered, forgotten, and waiting. The footprints and shorelines, the graves and tools, they all whisper the same thing, that this was once a place of life, not absence. Across the Sahara, on cliffs and plateaus and the walls of forgotten shelters, there are carvings and paintings that outlasted their makers by thousands of years. They have survived sandstorms, heat, and the slow disintegration of everything around them. To stand before them now is to look through a window that time has tried to close. The figures are faded, their pigments dulled by the centuries, but they're still clear enough to read if you learn how to listen to them. They speak not in words but in images, in gestures, in the way a line curves to suggest movement or water or hope. They are the oldest storytellers of the desert, and they speak of a Sahara that once breathed with rain and life. The most famous of these ancient artworks are found in places like Tassili Najjer in southeastern Algeria, a vast plateau of sandstone rising from the desert floor. From a distance, the landscape looks alien, jagged, sculpted by wind into arches and spires, but hidden in its canyons are tens of thousands of paintings and engravings. Some are small and simple. Others stretch across the walls of caves and rock faces, filling the space with color and motion. They show a world that feels impossible compared to the desert around it. There are people swimming, rivers teeming with fish, cattle grazing under trees, elephants and giraffes walking through open grasslands. The people who made these images lived in a green Sahara thousands of years before it became a desert. Archaeologists have dated many of the paintings to between 10,000 and 4,000 years ago, a span that covers the region's last great humid period. In that time, rainfall transformed the Sahara into a mosaic of savannas, lakes, and wetlands. The people who lived there painted what they saw and what they valued. The result is a visual record of the landscape's transformation as well as of humanity's adaptation to it. What's remarkable about these carvings and paintings is not just their age but their sophistication. The artists used mineral pigments, ochre, iron oxide, charcoal, to create shades of red, brown, yellow, and black. They used brushes made from animal hair or reeds, and sometimes painted with their fingers. Some scenes are simple outlines, others show shading, perspective, and detail that suggest observation and patience. Even the placement of the figures seems intentional, arranged in sequences that may tell stories or mark events. In the earliest layers, the art is dominated by animals. Huge creatures, buffalo, elephants, rhinos, are rendered with precision, their muscles and horns carefully drawn. These were the inhabitants of the Green Sahara, the same animals that roam sub-Saharan Africa today. Their presence tells us that this landscape once supported enough vegetation and water to sustain them. The artist likely saw these animals daily, perhaps hunted them, perhaps revered them. Some depictions show human figures smaller than the animals, suggesting awe or respect, or perhaps the simple scale of reality. Over time, the focus of the art changes. As the climate began to shift and herding took root, cattle appear in abundance. They're drawn in herds, sometimes accompanied by figures holding ropes or sticks, sometimes alone, surrounded by geometric patterns. The cattle scenes are so common that archaeologists call this phase the pastoral period. It represents a time when human life in the Sahara revolved around livestock, herding, milking, and moving with the seasons. To the people who made these paintings, cattle were not just food, they were a measure of wealth, a source of identity, and perhaps even a bridge between the earthly and the spiritual. Some of the rock art shows what appear to be rituals involving cattle, figures gathered around a central animal, arms raised or bodies painted. It's impossible to know exactly what these scenes meant, but they hint at early forms of ceremony, of shared belief. The repetition of the imagery suggests continuity. People were returning to the same places, performing the same acts, reaffirming their connection to water, animals, and one another. Among the most famous figures from Tassili Naja is one often called the Great God of Sephar, or the Horned God. It shows a large human-like figure with outstretched arms and horns, or a headdress extending from the head. Around it, smaller human figures seem to dance or reach upward. Some researchers see it as evidence of a belief system, an early expression of religion. Others interpret it more cautiously, as symbolic, perhaps representing fertility, rainfall, or leadership. Whatever it meant to its creators, it shows that these people were already thinking in abstract terms, connecting the cycles of nature to forces beyond themselves. And it wasn't just in Algeria. Across the Sahara, from the Tibesti Mountains in Chad to the Emedi Plateau and the Akakis of Libya, similar scenes appear: herds, hunters, ceremonies and symbols that repeat across vast distances. The consistency suggests communication, or at least shared ideas, even separated by hundreds of kilometers. The artists spoke the same visual language. It's one of the earliest examples of cultural unity across a continental landscape. As the centuries passed and the climate grew drier, the art changed again. The large animals disappeared from the imagery, replaced by camels and horses. These belonged to a later, more arid phase when the desert as we know it began to take shape. The shift in subject matter marks not just environmental change, but human adaptation. The people adjusted to the drying world, trading cattle for camels, changing their routes, their habits, their gods. Yet they continued to carve and paint, as if to record the transition, to leave a message for those who would one day find only sand. Many of the paintings also include geometric designs, circles, spirals, grids, and dotted patterns. Their meanings are uncertain, but they may represent maps, stars, or symbolic systems tied to the cycles of rain. Some researchers think the circles could mark watering holes or sacred sites. Others see them as purely decorative, but the persistence of these motifs across thousands of years suggests something deeper, a pattern of thought repeated by generations who saw meaning in the landscape's shapes. In a sense, these carvings are the Sahara's first written language. They record not just what happened, but how people understood it. Each line and curve encodes experience: what animals looked like, how people dressed, what they valued. There's no alphabet here, no grammar in the modern sense, but there's a structure of communication as clear as any script. To look at a wall of ancient paintings is to see a conversation frozen in time between humans and their world. Some scenes go beyond the physical and enter the symbolic. There are images of figures with masks or strange elongated heads, painted in ways that make them seem otherworldly. A few appear to float or to radiate lines from their bodies. These have often been sensationalized, interpreted as depictions of gods, spirits, or even extraterrestrial visitors. But most archaeologists see them differently. They likely represent ritual states, dance, trance, or ceremony, moments when people felt connected to forces larger than themselves. They might depict shamanic experiences, the kind found in many early cultures where the boundary between the material and the spiritual was porous. To the people who lived here, rain was not just a weather event, it was life returning from the sky. It determined when herds could graze, when crops could grow, when travel was possible. It's no wonder so many of their carvings and paintings seem to revolve around it. Some figures are shown with lines descending from above, interpreted by some as rainfall, by others as rays of power or light. In either case, they reflect an awareness of dependence on something both essential and unpredictable. To live in a landscape governed by the rhythm of rain is to live in constant negotiation with the heavens. When researchers analyze the pigments and techniques used in these artworks, they find layers of history literally stacked upon one another. In some caves, newer paintings overlap older ones, each generation adding its own story. Sometimes the newer artists respected the old images, painting around them. Other times they repurposed the space entirely, turning an elephant into a camel or a river scene into a caravan. These overlaps are like geological strata, showing how culture evolves alongside the climate. As the environment changed, so did the imagination. What these carvings and paintings also reveal is that memory can survive even when everything else disappears. The artists of the Sahara didn't know they were preserving history. They were recording moments important to them: successful hunts, changing seasons, rituals of gratitude. But because the desert dried so completely afterward, those moments endured. The same dryness that took away the rivers protected the images that once depicted them. Now they are the desert's memory, etched into its skin, and they're still teaching us. By comparing the animals shown in the art with the fossil record and climate data, scientists can reconstruct the timeline of the Sahara's transformation. The presence of aquatic species like fish and hippos indicates lakes and rivers. The later dominance of cattle and camels shows the shift to drier conditions. Even the style of the artwork, the pigments available, the themes chosen, tracks the environment's evolution. In a sense, the people who painted the Sahara left behind both an artistic and a scientific record. To walk among these paintings today is to feel something almost contradictory. The silence of the desert presses in, and yet the walls around you speak of noise, of herds and rainstorms, of laughter and ritual. The wind moves through the canyons, and for a moment it's possible to imagine that sound as a continuation of their voices. In the vastness of the Sahara, where dunes stretch like waves and wind hums across ancient rock, there are shapes that do not belong to chance. Circles of stone laid out by deliberate hands thousands of years ago rest in quiet alignment beneath the blazing sky. They sit half buried in sand, their edges worn by time, their meaning uncertain but unmistakably intentional. These are the stone circles of the desert, the forgotten architecture of a world that existed before the desert we know took hold. At first glance they seem simple, rings of rocks, sometimes a few meters wide, sometimes sprawling across entire ridges. Some are solitary, others appear in clusters, forming networks that stretch across kilometers. To anyone stumbling upon them today, they might look like the remains of campsites or perhaps the foundations of ancient dwellings. But as archaeologists studied them more closely, it became clear that these circles were far more than random arrangements. They were built with care, often with a sense of symmetry and orientation that hints at purpose beyond shelter or convenience. One of the most remarkable examples lies in the southwestern desert of Egypt, at a place known as Nabta Playa. Here, on the flat expanse of an ancient dry lake bed, archaeologists discovered a group of megalithic structures that predate Stonehenge by more than 1,000 years. When the site was first examined in the late 20th century, it appeared as little more than scattered stones. But when researchers began mapping their positions, patterns emerged, patterns that suggested planning, astronomy, and ritual. At the heart of Nabta Playa is a circle of standing stones about 4 meters in diameter. The stones are rough, unshaped, and modest in size, yet their placement is anything but random. Some align with the cardinal directions. Others point towards specific positions on the horizon, where the sun rises and sets during solstices. When the alignments were tested against astronomical data, the results were striking. Around 7,000 years ago, the stones would have marked the summer solstice, an event that signaled the onset of the rainy season in the region. For the people who lived there, this was not just a date, it was a promise of survival. The builders of Nabta Playa were herders and early farmers, people who had already learned to read the land and sky. Their livelihood depended on knowing when the rains would come, when to move their cattle, when to gather. The stone circle, in that context, was more than a monument. It was a calendar, a tool for predicting the rhythms of the earth. Each solstice, each shift in the stars carried meaning. In marking it, they were connecting their lives to the wider cycles of the planet. Around the central circle are other stone arrangements, lines, clusters, and small mounds that may have served as ceremonial or burial sites. Excavations revealed hearths, pottery fragments, and bones, all evidence of gatherings that took place here seasonally. People traveled long distances to Nabta Playa, drawn by the promise of water when the player filled during the wet months. It was a meeting place, both practical and spiritual. When the rains came, the lake formed a shallow mirror reflecting the sky above. In that reflection, the stones would have seemed doubled. Earth and sky joined in symmetry. It's easy to imagine how that site could become sacred. The stones themselves were not sourced from nearby. Some were carried from several kilometers away, hauled across the plains by human hands. That effort alone suggests that the site held deep importance. You don't move tons of rock through the desert unless what you're building matters. And what they built has endured, not because of size, but because of precision. Even now, thousands of years later, the alignments remain accurate, a silent testament to knowledge that predates writing by millennia. Nabta Playa is not alone. Similar, though less well known, stone circles have been found across the Sahara and Sahel, each with its own mysteries. In the Adrar Plateau of Mauritania, near the edge of the desert's western expanse, there are dozens of circular and oval stone structures, some containing burial chambers, others forming open enclosures. Their age varies, but many are prehistoric, dating back to the same era as Nabta Playa. The patterns repeat: symmetry, alignment, deliberate construction. Some circles even appear to mirror constellations, suggesting that the connection between sky and stone was widespread, not isolated. Further north, in the Fezzan region of Libya, archaeologists have documented hundreds of small cairns and circular stone enclosures scattered across ridges and plains. Many are burial sites containing human remains and grave goods, beads, pottery, tools. The dead were laid to rest in the same patterns that guided the living, circles marking both life and death. It's a geometry that recurs again and again throughout human history. A circle has no beginning and no end. In a landscape where everything seems temporary, a circle promises continuity. The circular form also appears in more subtle ways, in hearths, in storage pits, in the layout of ancient campsites. Some researchers suggest that this repetition reflects more than practicality. It may represent a world view, a sense of belonging to cycles, the day, the year, the life, the rain, the drought. For the people of the Green Sahara, the circle was not just a shape, it was a reflection of their environment, where everything moved in patterns that repeated, though never exactly the same. Beyond their symbolic or astronomical roles, the stone circles may also have served social functions. In many early societies, gathering places were central to identity. They were where groups met to trade, to form alliances, to share news and rituals. The circles of Nabta, Playa, and elsewhere could have been such meeting grounds marked permanently in stone, so that even as landscapes changed, the memory of gathering remained fixed. A traveller crossing the plains would know the direction of the circle, the time of year when others would come, the significance of the solstice or the flood. In a world without borders or writing, the stones were landmarks of meaning. Archaeologists studying Nabta Playa found another layer of complexity beneath the surface. Buried in the sand nearby were the remains of what may have been huts or small structures suggesting longer stays. There were also traces of cattle bones carefully placed in pits, possibly offerings. These finds point toward ritual, toward acts of devotion or gratitude tied to water and fertility. The builders of these circles were not merely marking time. They were engaging with it, acknowledging its power. The knowledge required to construct these alignments was significant. To identify the solstice, you must observe the horizon over many years, noting where the sun rises and sets. To fix that observation in stone requires planning, cooperation, and memory passed from generation to generation. These were not casual undertakings. They were expressions of accumulated wisdom, of a relationship with the land that was both scientific and spiritual. As the Sahara began to dry again around 5,000 years ago, sites like Nabta Playa were gradually abandoned. The lakes shrank, the grass withered, and the people moved on, but the stones remained. They outlasted the culture that built them, outlasted the rivers that once reflected them. When the desert finally closed over them, they waited in silence until the modern age uncovered them again. The rediscovery of these circles in the 20th century forced historians to rethink the timeline of human development. For a long time, complex structures like these were assumed to have originated in Europe or the Near East. The idea that people in the heart of Africa, long before the pharaohs, could have built observatories and ceremonial centers challenged old assumptions. Yet the evidence is undeniable. The Sahara's megaliths are among the world's earliest examples of human attempts to understand and record cosmic order. Even more intriguing is how these early African structures may have influenced later developments. As people migrated eastward toward the Nile, they carried their knowledge with them, the concept of aligning the earthly with the celestial, the habit of marking sacred space with stone. When Egyptian builders raised the first temples and tombs, they continued that tradition, orienting their monuments toward the stars. The lineage of those alignments can be traced back through time, from the pyramids to the circles buried in the desert. In the silence of Nabta Playa, the stones still catch the light as the sun rises and sets, just as they did thousands of years ago. The horizon has shifted, the climate has changed, but the relationship between stone and sky remains. It's easy to imagine the herders who once gathered there, watching the same alignment, waiting for the first clouds of the rainy season to build in the distance. The desert would have smelled of dust and anticipation. The air would have been still, the sound of cattle low and patient. And then one morning the sun would rise exactly between the stones, and they would know it was time to move, to plant, to celebrate. The significance of such a moment cannot be overstated. It was knowledge encoded in the land itself, knowledge that bound people to place. The circle was both tool and temple, a convergence of observation and reverence. Even as the world changed around them, the stones anchored meaning. The desert was not born in a single moment. It arrived slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a long exhale that never stopped. For generations, the people of the Green Sahara must have watched it happen without realizing what it would become. A few seasons of poor rain, a river that ran lower than usual, a lake that took longer to refill. These small changes were easy to accept at first, easy to adapt to. The earth has moods, after all, and the people who lived close to it understood that better than anyone. But then the pattern began to stretch. The seasons of rain grew shorter. The dry spells grew longer. The grass turned brittle. The dust lingered. Eventually the land began to shift beneath their feet, and the Sahara started its slow transformation into the desert we know today. The cause of that shift lay far beyond anything the people could see. It wasn't punishment or misfortune, it was astronomy. Earth's orbit around the sun is not constant. Over tens of thousands of years, the planet's tilt and shape of its path change slightly, altering how sunlight reaches different regions. These gradual variations, known as Milankovitch cycles, drive the great pulses of climate through history, the advance and retreat of ice, the greening and drying of continents. Around 6,000 years ago, those celestial rhythms began to turn again. The northern hemisphere's summers grew a little cooler. The monsoon rains that had once swept deep into the Sahara began to weaken and retreat southward. At first, the effect would have been subtle. The rains still came, just less predictably. Lakes shrank slightly each year, their shorelines drawing back like the edge of a receding tide. Rivers that had flowed wide began to fragment into shallow channels. Herds of animals moved farther and farther in search of water. For people living through it, the change might have seemed temporary, a drought perhaps, something to endure. But the pattern didn't reverse. The green began to fade, slowly but relentlessly. In sediment cores taken from ancient lake beds, scientists can trace this transformation grain by grain. Layers of clay and organic matter give way to sand and dust, marking the transition from wet to dry. Pollen trapped in those layers tells the same story. Grass species vanish, replaced by desert shrubs. Fossilized shells of aquatic snails disappear entirely, replaced by wind-blown grains carried from afar. The change wasn't instantaneous, but it was profound. Within a few thousand years, a blink in geological time, the Sahara had crossed a threshold from savanna to sand. The shift did not happen evenly. Some regions dried faster than others. In the highlands, where mountains trapped the last threads of moisture, patches of green lingered for centuries. Oases formed where groundwater still reached the surface, creating islands of life amid an expanding sea of dryness. These oases became the last refuges for both people and animals. Communities that once roamed freely across open plains now clustered around these shrinking pockets of fertility, adjusting their lives to scarcity. At sites like Nabta Playa, the record of that adjustment is written in the ground. The stone circles that once aligned with the solstice stopped being maintained. The seasonal gatherings ceased. Paths and dwellings show signs of abandonment. People began to move on, their paths following the last traces of water eastward and southward. As they went, they carried their knowledge, their traditions, and their memory of a greener world. For scientists, this period marks one of the most significant environmental transitions in human prehistory. It reshaped not only the land but the trajectory of civilizations. As the Sahara dried, populations that had once been scattered across its lakes and grasslands were forced to concentrate along permanent rivers and coasts. Nowhere was this more transformative than along the Nile. There, migrants from the desert brought with them skills honed by centuries of managing water and herds. They understood seasons, astronomy, and survival in marginal environments. When they arrived at the Nile's dependable floodplain, they found stability unlike anything the desert could now offer. Out of that stability, agriculture flourished, and from agriculture came cities, monuments, and kingdoms. The drying of the Sahara, in other words, didn't end a civilization, it moved it. The knowledge born of adaptation became the foundation for something new. What had once been pastoral wisdom became agricultural engineering. What had once been sky-watching for rainfall became the science of calendars. In a quiet, indirect way, the climate shift that created the Sahara also created Egypt. But for those who stayed behind, life became increasingly harsh. The shrinking lakes became salt flats. The rivers disappeared underground, leaving behind dry wadis that only carried water during rare storms. Sand encroached on once fertile valleys, burying evidence of former abundance. The people who remained had to adapt again, relying on wells, trading routes, and livestock that could endure the heat. The camel, though not yet domesticated during the earliest phases of desertification, would eventually become the key to survival, turning the Sahara from a barrier into a bridge once more. To imagine living through that transformation is to imagine a slow grief. Each generation would have known less water than the one before. Grandparents might have spoken of lakes that their grandchildren would never see. The sky would have seemed emptier, the rains later, the winds harsher. Over time, adaptation became resignation. Camps grew smaller. Travel became riskier. The once open corridors of migration turned to dunes. Yet, even in that loss, there was ingenuity. People learned to dig deeper wells, to use every drop efficiently, to track underground aquifers by reading the patterns of plants and insects. They developed new tools and new routes of exchange, connecting distant oases through early trade. What had once been a land of abundance became a land of endurance, and those who mastered it became some of the most resilient communities on Earth. The climate shift also left its mark in the genetic and linguistic patterns of the people who descended from those migrations. Modern studies suggest that populations across North and West Africa, the Nile Valley, and even parts of the Middle East share ancestry linked to these ancient Saharan peoples. As the desert expanded, their descendants spread outward, blending with others, carrying fragments of their old world into new ones. Languages shifted, myths evolved, but the memory of a lost Greenland persisted. In some oral traditions from the Sahel and beyond, there are still stories of a place to the north where grass once grew high and rivers flowed endlessly, a place swallowed by sand. As the Sahara dried and the last of its great lakes disappeared into dust, People who had once known the rhythm of rains and the wide sweep of green plains began to move. They did not move all at once. The transition was gradual, a long migration that unfolded across generations. Families followed the retreating water, herders searched for new pastures, and traders traced the old riverbeds toward the east, where one river never failed. The Nile became the great thread that gathered the scattered lives of the Sahara into something new. The river was constant even when the world around it changed. Every year it rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, flooding the land and leaving behind a ribbon of fertile soil. For those who arrived from the desert, it must have seemed miraculous. After years of unreliable rain and shrinking lakes, here was a waterway that renewed itself season after season. It was not just a place to live, it was stability itself. The people who settled along its banks did not arrive as blank slates. They carried with them the knowledge of the land they had left behind. They understood water and the cycles that governed it. They had learned to measure time by the stars, to mark the solstices and track the seasons. They had herded animals, built with stone, and honored the patterns of nature through art and ceremony. When they reached the Nile Valley, they applied that same intelligence to a new environment. What emerged over time was not merely a community, but the seed of civilization. Before cities and temples, before pharaohs and writing, there were small villages. Archaeological evidence from sites like Merimde, Fayum, and Badari show settlements that appeared along the Nile around 6,000 years ago. They were modest clusters of huts surrounded by fields of barley and emmer wheat. The people farmed, fished, and raised cattle, just as their ancestors had done in the Green Sahara. They built granaries to store their harvests and dug channels to guide the floodwaters. These early farmers did not invent agriculture from nothing. They adapted it from what they already knew, transforming the knowledge of herding and seasonal movement into the practice of settled life. The rhythm of the Nile shaped everything. When the floods came, the fields disappeared underwater, and work turned to waiting. When the waters receded, they left behind rich black silt that could grow crops without fertilizer. Life became a cycle, dependable and predictable, mirroring the cosmic order the desert people had once observed in the stars. In that predictability, society found its foundation. Trade flourished early. The Nile was not just a river, it was a highway. Boats made from papyrus reeds carried goods between villages, grain, pottery, fish, and stone tools. From the south came gold and ivory. From the north came salt and shell ornaments from the Mediterranean coast. The connections that once linked the Sahara's oases now followed the river's course. Communities grew not in isolation but in communication. Ideas like goods traveled easily on the water. As populations increased, so did complexity. Larger settlements developed specialized crafts, pottery, weaving, tool-making. The control of water became more organized. Simple ditches turned into irrigation networks. Leadership evolved naturally from necessity. Someone had to decide when to open and close the channels, when to plant, when to harvest. Authority, at first practical, became symbolic. Those who managed water managed life. The desert past was never forgotten. The earliest Egyptian symbols for life, fertility and rebirth are often tied to water and the sun, the same forces that had governed existence in the Sahara. The circle, a form that dominated the old desert monuments, reappears in Egyptian iconography as the sun disk, as the shape of eternity. Even the orientation of early temples and settlements reflected the same fascination with celestial cycles that once guided the builders of Nabta Playa. Civilization along the Nile grew from the same impulse to understand the world by aligning with it. The transition from scattered villages to organized society was gradual but unmistakable. The knowledge of how to work with nature deepened. People learned to predict the Nile's flood with remarkable accuracy, using the rising of certain stars as a guide, most notably Sirius, whose first appearance in the dawn sky each year coincided with the beginning of the inundation. This link between the heavens and the earth, between astronomy and survival, became the backbone of Egyptian thought. The idea that the cosmos had order, and that human life should reflect that order, shaped everything from architecture to religion. By the time the first kings emerged, ruling small territories along the river, the groundwork for empire had already been laid by centuries of adaptation and migration. The leaders who unified Upper and Lower Egypt were inheritors of a long chain of knowledge, passed down from the people who had once built stone circles in the desert. They understood that power was not only control over people, but mastery of the environment, the irrigation of fields, the storage of grain, the alignment of temples. All were extensions of the same principle: harmony with the cycles of the world. Even the gods they created carried echoes of the desert past. Hathor, one of the oldest deities, was often depicted as a cow, an image that links directly to the pastoral cultures of the Green Sahara. The reverence for cattle, visible in rock art thousands of years older than Egypt's first temples, found new form in religion. The sun god Ra, rising and setting each day, embodied the same cyclical time that desert herders once tracked in the solstices. The god Osiris, whose death and resurrection mirrored the annual flooding and retreat of the Nile, carried within him the same understanding of renewal that governed life in the vanished grasslands. The story of how the Sahara's people became the architects of civilization is not only about progress, it's about continuity. The slow accumulation of understanding passed hand to hand from the green plains to the banks of the Nile. Each step along the way was a response to change. Each adaptation carried within it the memory of what came before. When the first empire rose, it did not rise from nothing. It rose from the desert's memory, from the oases that sustained life when the world around them faded, from the quiet persistence of people who refused to vanish. The sand remembers. It may not hold words, but it keeps stories in other ways. Buried fragments of pottery, the outlines of old hearths, the shapes of vanished rivers. Yet not all memory lives in the earth. Some of it survives in people, carried in voices, in songs, in the quiet repetition of tales told under the same stars that once reflected in ancient lakes. When the water disappeared and the dunes began to rise, the people of the Sahara carried more than tools and cattle with them. They carried memory. Over time, that memory turned into story, and story became myth. Across North Africa and the Sahel, echoes of the Sahara's greener past linger in oral traditions that have outlasted geography. Among Tuareg, Berber, Tubu, and Fulani communities, stories still speak of lands that were once full of rivers and forests, of ancestors who lived beside great waters that no longer exist. These aren't tales of imagination alone. They are recollections softened and reshaped by centuries of retelling, but grounded in real landscapes that time has changed beyond recognition. In some versions, the lakes are described as gifts from the gods, vast shining mirrors dropped from the sky. In others, they are described as living beings, generous but easily angered, retreating underground when humans grew careless. The moral shifts with each culture, but the theme remains constant. Water once abundant, withdrawn because of imbalance. To people whose world depends entirely on rain, such myths are more than allegory. They are memory given moral form. Among the Tuareg, whose ancestors have crossed the central Sahara for centuries, there are stories of a great river that once flowed through the desert, connecting distant lands. Some elders still speak of traces of this river, visible after certain storms, lines of green that appear briefly when the sand shifts just right. Modern scientists call this the Tamanrasset River, a buried channel mapped only recently through satellite radar, but for the Tuareg it has always been known, not as a river of the past, but as a hidden one, a presence just beneath the surface, asleep but not gone. What makes these oral traditions remarkable is not only their persistence, but their accuracy. When geographers compare certain myths to modern hydrological maps, correlations appear. A tale about a well that sings may describe the sound of air echoing in deep limestone shafts. A story about a sea that hides beneath the dunes aligns with known aquifer locations. The past, preserved through story, often anticipates scientific discovery. It's a reminder that knowledge doesn't always require instruments. It can live in language shaped by observation and necessity. These oral histories are not just cultural artifacts. They are maps of survival in a landscape where written records vanish. Stories become navigation tools. A tale about a spirit who guards a spring might, to a listener, mark the location of that spring. A myth about a sleeping lake might correspond to an area where groundwater still lies close to the surface. Over centuries, memory wrapped itself in story so that even as generations passed, the knowledge remained useful. In many ways, these myths are the emotional continuation of the landscapes that disappeared. When the lakes and rivers went silent, their voices moved into story. The people kept speaking for them, keeping their presence alive in narrative form. To this day, some desert travelers pour a small measure of water into the sand before drinking, a gesture of acknowledgement, as if sharing with the spirits of those old waters. In the stillness of the Sahara, such acts are both prayer and remembrance. The persistence of these stories across millennia also raises a deeper question about human memory itself. How far back can oral history truly reach? Can a story survive 10,000 years? In the case of the Sahara, the evidence suggests it can. The physical changes in the landscape happened slowly enough that each generation could pass its knowledge to the next. The result was a chain of memory stretching across epochs long enough to carry the image of a green desert into a world that no longer recognizes it. In that sense, the Sahara's myths are not only records of the past, they're time machines. They transport fragments of lived experience across ages, compressing history into narrative. When a modern storyteller speaks of a river that sleeps beneath the sand, they are echoing voices that once heard that river flow. The continuity is almost unimaginable, yet it exists, an unbroken thread of human awareness binding us to an environment that has transformed completely. And perhaps that's why the desert feels so heavy with silence. It isn't emptiness, it's density. Every grain of sand covers a story. Every windstorm rearranges the surface of memory. The people who still move through it, guiding caravans or tending oases, walk across the graves of rivers and the whispers of lakes. They live among echoes, some scientific, some spiritual, all part of the same conversation between human beings and the planet they inhabit. Night falls differently over the Sahara. When the sun sinks beyond the dunes, the horizon does not darken immediately. It lingers, glowing faintly, as if the sky itself is reluctant to leave. The air cools slowly. The sand, which held heat all day, releases it in a soft exhale. The stars appear one by one, then all at once, too many to count. In that moment, the desert feels infinite, not in distance, but in time. It is as though every age that ever passed through it is still here, folded within the quiet. The Sahara at night is not silent, though it seems so from a distance. The wind moves like breath through the dunes, shaping them grain by grain. Small insects click beneath the sand, burrowing deeper as the temperature drops. Somewhere far off, perhaps miles away, a lone jackal calls into the darkness, and the sound carries farther than it should. The air here does not stop anything. It only stretches it thin. Every sound becomes part of the landscape, like the faint echo of memory. If you stand in the middle of this vastness, there is no horizon to hold on to. The sky curves down until it feels close enough to touch, and the ground beneath your feet feels like it could shift at any second. Everything is movement disguised as stillness. The stars wheel slowly, the dunes drift imperceptibly, and the earth itself tilts along its long orbit, drawing the future toward you one fraction of a degree at a time. The Sahara, for all its silence, is never asleep. It dreams. Its dreams are long and patient. They stretch across epochs, from when it was an ocean floor to when it was a forest, from when people built with stone to when they left only footprints that the wind carried away. The desert remembers all of it. It remembers the rivers that carved it, the rains that softened it, the voices that once crossed it. Those memories don't vanish. They lie beneath the surface, waiting for light or water or curiosity to uncover them again. In the places where the dunes part, where rock breaks through the surface, you can still find the remnants of the Sahara's green centuries. Petrified wood lies scattered like bones. Fossilized shells glint in the sun. Sometimes, if you dig just a little, you find smooth pebbles that were once worn by the waves of an ancient lake. Each fragment is a sentence in the desert's long story, a sentence that doesn't end, only pauses. It's strange to think that all this emptiness was once crowded with animals, with plants, with people, but the emptiness itself is part of the story. It is what remains after the cycle turns. Every civilization, every forest, every ocean eventually gives way to silence. The Sahara shows that clearly, without cruelty. It teaches by example that change is not destruction, but continuation. The desert doesn't erase, it transforms. It takes what was and turns it into what will be. The people who live along its edges today still carry that understanding. They move with the seasons, travel by stars, measure distance by the time it takes for light to fade on the horizon. Their traditions are quiet lessons in endurance. In their songs and stories, the desert is never simply barren. It is alive, conscious, aware. It tests, but it also teaches. To survive here is not to conquer, but to listen, to learn its moods and respect its boundaries. If you imagine the desert's future, you can almost see its dreams taking shape again. The same valleys that now lie dry could one day fill with rivers. The same basins could cradle lakes. Seeds buried deep might bloom once more. The fossils of trees might become trees again. It sounds like fantasy, but it isn't. It's simply the planet's rhythm, long and slow, repeating. When it happens, people will return. They always do. Life will find the old roots, settle near the familiar waters, and begin again. Perhaps that's the most humbling truth the Sahara offers, that nothing truly disappears. Civilizations end, languages fade, but the patterns remain waiting for their turn. The desert keeps them safe, wrapped in sand and silence. When the time is right, it gives them back. The winds shift, the rains return, and memory becomes landscape again. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear that in the wind tonight, a faint promise beneath the constant motion, like breath in sleep. The dunes sigh softly, the sand slips over itself, and somewhere far beneath, water still moves, deep and slow. The desert isn't dead, it is dreaming, and in those dreams are the traces of everything it has ever been. The first lakes, the herders who carved on stone, the hidden cities buried in time, the myths carried by travelers, the stars mirrored in the water's surface. All of it still exists here, in a form that only the patient can read. The Sahara doesn't forget, it waits. One day, when the earth tilts again and the cycle turns, this sea of sand will awaken. Rivers will flow where dunes once stood. The air will smell of rain. The stars will still be in their places, watching. And maybe on some quiet night, people will sit beside the new lakes, telling stories about the age when the desert slept. They will speak of how their ancestors once crossed an ocean of sand, following memory, guided by stars, carrying the idea that everything returns if you wait long enough. Until then, the Sahara remains as it is, vast, luminous, endlessly shifting. It teaches through stillness, reminding us that even in apparent emptiness, there is movement, connection, and continuity. The dunes will keep their slow rhythm, the wind will keep sculpting their edges, and beneath it all, the planet will keep turning. The desert dreams on, it always has. And somewhere in that dream, humanity still walks its ancient shores, listening to the whisper of time carried softly through the sand. Thank you for drifting through this journey tonight, for listening to the silence of the Sahara and the echoes of what it once was. These stories are small reminders that the earth is not static, that everything we stand on has lived other lives before ours. The desert, the oceans, the forests, They're all chapters in the same long memory. If this calm exploration helped you slow down or think a little differently about the world beneath your feet, you can stay close to it. Subscribe if you'd like to keep exploring with me. Every story here begins the same way, quietly, with a question about how the planet remembers itself. For now, rest easy. Let your mind wander like wind over sand. The earth is still turning, the dunes are still shifting, and somewhere in the dark, the desert is still dreaming. Good night, from Simply About Earth. Sleep well,